Interesting topic this morning. Little dark, it wounds my soul a bit, but it's something that we definitely need to be aware of and learn about. And we're so thankful to have a super awesome professional here who knows, what's going on and everything about that. So please give me please give Mr. Alan Wilcott a round, warm little applause as he comes up here and talks to us this morning.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thank you. First of all, good morning. And second of all, that applause was a little bit weak. I'm used to a little better than that. I'm just telling you. I'm just going to say that straight up. I'm just kidding. No, this is fantastic. Great to be here. A little bit about myself, just to kind of tell you what my perspective is of course I'm retired law enforcement. So I spent 27 years out on the street working law enforcement. Retired about 2 years ago. And I actually retired from somewhere really close to here, the Pasco Sheriff's Office. So I retired from here, but I have worked in all of our area human trafficking task force. I headed up our local task force here in Pasco. The Human Trafficking Commission of Pasco is something that I'm very proud to say that we initiated here during my tenure here with the Sheriff's Office. And today I still work in this space very heavily, work with several different organizations fighting human trafficking, including the Attorney General's statewide Council on Human Trafficking, which is known as the DSO, the Florida Alliance to End Human Trafficking. So I'm the vice chair of that, and on and on. All that stuff is kind of boring, really no need to go into all that, but just to kind of lay the foundation that when I talk about human trafficking, the perspective that I will come from will be obviously a very heavily law enforcement perspective. So I'm not coming from just a kind of a community activist, but really from that law enforcement perspective. There will be some things that I will just warn you straight up. They told me that I only have 6 hours to do this. So I'm going to have to really fly to get that done in these 6 hours. So for the next few minutes, and the reason why I say that is because oftentimes when I'm training around the country on human trafficking, obviously we're doing trainings that are either law enforcement specific or NGOs that are operating in that space, and we're looking at all-day trainings. And so I'm going to try to give you a very large piece of information and do that in just 20 minutes or so. Okay, so it's going to be a lot of information, and I will tell you that I'm going to fly at the beginning of it, because there's a specific part that if you're a parent or a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle, or you work in church ministry, it is critical that you get this piece of information. So I really want to get there. So that's where we're going to fly to get to, and then I'll take a few questions and we'll call it a day. So thank you for the invitation to be here. It's always a privilege. I think I was scheduled to be here last month, but last month was National Human Trafficking Awareness Month, and I was all over the place. So it was a really tough month to try to get here. So thank you for the grace to push that off for a month and be here in February instead. Just got back from the Super Bowl. I wish I could say that I was actually at the Super Bowl, but as usual in my line of work, I'm working around the Super Bowl. I said, this is my 6th Super Bowl to go to, and I've never seen the Super Bowl game. I've always been 3 or 4 blocks away doing this dirty, dark work that we're talking about today that surrounds events like that. So I got back from Phoenix and still trying to recover from that. And so it's good to be here today. We're going to jump right into it today. So what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about human trafficking, obviously, and I want to start very basic, kind of what it is. What is human trafficking? Because there's a lot of misconceptions as to what human trafficking is and what it's not. So we'll start there. We'll start at that base level. And then we're going to move into a little more of some of the advanced scope, functions, forms. What does it look like? And then how does it present itself to you? Because I think that's probably the more critical piece. Is I can talk about nationally or international trafficking. If that doesn't make sense to you, then what good did I do today? But how does it present to you? What does it look like when you're walking around Newport Richey or Port Richey or Hudson or Holiday or wherever that may be? And I will tell you that in my work with kind of heading up our human trafficking task force for Pasco, one of the areas that we worked obviously was 19. So 19 was a really strong corridor for human trafficking activity, and we work that very hard. What most people don't realize is if you move to the east side of the county and get toward Day City and Zephyr Hills and that area over there, we had a lot of labor trafficking as well as sex trafficking going on. So people don't sometimes put that into perspective. So we worked a lot on the 19 corridor, but we were also on the east side working probably different types of human trafficking than what we normally think about when we think about human trafficking. So let's talk about human trafficking. First thing I'm going to say is you're going to look at a definition. And this is kind of where human trafficking came from. The United Nations in the Palermo Protocol kind of defined what human trafficking is. And then the United States, and you'll see it on the next slide, the United States passed a law called the TVPA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. That was passed in the year 2000. So I want to kind of let that set in for a minute. Prior to the year 2000, we didn't have a criminal statute to charge somebody with human trafficking. Now, was human trafficking going on before 2000? Absolutely, it was, right? So human trafficking's been going on since kind of the beginning of mankind. And I give you a street definition in a minute, you'll recognize that immediately. Human trafficking's been going on since the forming of man. However, I didn't have, from a law enforcement perspective, I did not have the tools to charge somebody with human trafficking prior to the year 2000. And that was a federal statute. Florida came in about 3 years later and passed our first human trafficking statute, which is the 796 statute. And we passed that in about the year 2003 or so. We began to look at it in the state of Florida. So United Nations defined human trafficking. You see their definition. But the one thing I want you to really look at on this screen is that human trafficking and smuggling are not the same crime. The news media almost always will call a smuggling case a human trafficking case. And so it's important sometimes to understand the difference between smuggling and trafficking. I just got a call a couple of weeks ago for to do an interview for a television station down in the Fort Myers area where the Highway Patrol had pulled somebody over on Alligator Alley, and they had a smuggling case, but they were calling it a human trafficking case. So it's kind of important to notice what the difference in those two things are. So what is smuggling? Smuggling is the unauthorized movement of something across a sovereign border without proper authorization. So that's what smuggling is. That can be guns, it can be dope, it can be people. That's a smuggling case. It can be money, currency, whatever that may be. If it's moving across a sovereign border without authorization, that's smuggling. Trafficking is a crime against the person. It does not require movement. That's important. Smuggling requires movement across the border. Trafficking doesn't require. In fact, many cases of human trafficking that we investigate, they've not been moved at all. They're being trafficked out of their own house. Something that we call familial trafficking, where their own families are trafficking them. A grandmother trafficking her granddaughter. One of the cases that I worked that was probably the most egregious and the youngest victim that I ever had the opportunity to recover was a little 8-year-old girl. And she was being trafficked by her two uncles in her own house. So her uncles were dressing her up in a birthday outfit and selling her to men to come in and have their way with that little 8-year-old girl. Started when she was 4. So those are the types of things where it's not a movement case, it's an exploitation case. So it doesn't require movement, it's a crime against the person, whereas smuggling is a crime against the border. So that's the difference between those two. When you look at, and this is the TVPA, I'm not going to read this. You can see the legal language. This is our law, the United States, passed this federally in the year 2000. It gets authorized about every 3 years. In fact, a part of it just got authorized. I was in D.C. earlier this year, just got authorized this year, and partial reauthorization. But this is what it talks about. The act, what is done, the means, or how is it done, and the purpose. And you can see up on the screen kind of what that legal language is. That's known as the TVPA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. Let me give you a street definition for what human trafficking is. When one person takes advantage of the vulnerabilities of another person for a commercial gain. Human trafficking. One person takes advantage of the vulnerabilities of another person for a commercial gain. Human trafficking. I want to key in on a word that I just used, commercial gain. Does that mean money? It can be. So money is part of a commercial gain. If I sell somebody for $35 for a sexual act, is that human trafficking? Sure. So you got money involved. However, in most cases, or I don't want to say most, but in many cases that involve particularly a minor, money is usually not the gain. It's usually going to be food. It's going to be a place to sleep. It's going to be what's known as survival sex. It's going to be couch surfing with a sexual act involved in it. If it is a minor, oftentimes it's not money, but it's going to be dope. It's going to be a place to sleep. It's going to be food. That's going to be the commercial gain. A case locally where a 14-year-old runs from our area and runs to Orlando, run away from home. She's not a chronic runaway, but she runs away from home because she's mad at her mom. She ends up in Orlando. She meets a 15-year-old out on the street who's pretty streetwise, kind of a chronic runaway. The 15-year-old tells her, "Do you have a place to sleep tonight?" "No, I don't. I'm mad at mom. I'm mad at mom." That was the whole purpose. I'm mad at mom, and I'm going to show my mother what it's like to be what she is. She's just mad at her. She ends up being told by this 15-year-old, "I can get you a place to sleep tonight, but you're going to have to give a certain act in order to get that place to sleep." She said, "Well, I don't have any place to sleep. Maybe I can just kind of sneak in." She goes to Joe's trailer. Joe tells her, "Yep, you can sleep on the couch, but you're going to have to do this." Is that a commercial gain? Sure. My responsibility is go to the local hotel. How much do you charge a night? $119. Now I can attach a commercial value to a sexual act she was made to perform to get that. And if it's a minor, because you see up here, human trafficking requires me to prove force, fraud, or coercion, unless it's a minor. If it's a minor, I don't have to prove force, fraud, or coercion. If a minor, because they can't consent, if a minor is engaged in a sexual or labor act for a commercial gain, I have human trafficking. So I don't have to prove that. Here are some of the forms. I'm not going to go through this except to say, and some of the things like forced labor, you can see what some of the forms are and what it looks like. Agriculture, landscaping, construction, all of those can have a forced labor component. One thing that most of us don't really recognize is your Asian nail salons. I've been in almost every one of those in this county, and I can tell you that in my view, almost 100% of those were a forced labor component. The problem for us is it's hard to get them to self-identify, to report. Because in their mind, they're better off now than what they were when they came from usually China, the country that they came from. And so it's hard to get that reporting mechanism involved. But Asian nail salons is oftentimes overlooked. You can see the commercial sex side, involuntary servitude, which in Florida, we roll that up into the forced labor side. Here's kind of the scope. And again, I'm going through this very quickly, but I want you to just kind of catch some of this information. I want to get to one particular part. The global scope, the map that you're looking up at right now is designed to kind of show you the supply and demand of human trafficking globally. Now, when I say globally, how many victims of human trafficking are there in the world right now? Thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions? And the answer to that is, according to the International Labor Organization, that right now there are 50 million victims of human trafficking globally. 50 million. 10 million additional victims in just the last 2 years. And most of that is because of our southern border. Now, I'm not going to be politically correct today. I'm just going to tell you the truth. Our southern border being wide open, that migration is causing a huge influx of human trafficking, and especially among kids. These undocumented, unaccompanied minors who come into our country and then they just disappear. Do you think they're vulnerable? Absolutely. And so that vulnerability is what that trafficker is targeting. And so, but not just that, but the war in Ukraine was a huge throwing of victims on the market, because those women and children fleeing Ukraine and ending up in those Poland and Belarus and some of those areas around there obviously become hugely vulnerable to being exploited by international traffickers. And so you see 10 million in just the last 2 years. 10 million. in just the last 2 years. But what you see on the screen is, where are these victims coming from? So those countries that you see in red and shades of red are known as supply countries. So those are the countries where globally these victims are being put on the market for supply. The countries that are in blue and shades of blue are consuming countries. And just to give you a reference, the darker the country is in blue, so the darker blue, the more that country consumes. And when you look up at this map, sometimes it becomes kind of startling, because look at our country, the United States of America, a country that I love dearly, a country that I've given my adult life to try to serve its communities because I love this country. But we are the number one consuming country in the world. And that's both sex trafficking and labor trafficking. We are number one. And if that's true, and it is, where's it happening? So this heat map that you're looking at, and any of you can go see this map, and I'll give you where it came from, so I'll source it for you. It comes from Polaris Project. So polarisproject.org, and why do I mention their name? Because they're responsible by federal contract to run the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So they run the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and I'm just going to throw the number out there. It's 888-3737-888. So that is the National Human Trafficking Hotline. What I encourage everyone to do, including everyone sitting in this room, is to put that in your phone, in your contacts, the National Human Trafficking Hotline. Put hotline, human trafficking as a contact, and if you see something suspicious, call that number and report it. That information gets to the local task force. So it's a critical number. And that number again, and I'll just say it kind of slowly so you can write it down or tap it into your contacts on your phone, but it's 888-3737-888. And I would encourage you to put that in your phone as a contact. That's an action you can do right now. A positive action that can have an impact in someone's life. So critical. So they run the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and they give us this heat map. And when somebody calls in a report of human trafficking, when they call in a report, the National Human Trafficking Hotline records that, and then every year they put out this heat map. Where's it coming from? Where's these reports of human trafficking? And look at this heat map. A couple things I'll point out here before we move on. The eastern seaboard, western seaboard, the Gulf of Mexico, red hot. Look at Florida, red hot. Look at Florida, red hot. Now I'm going to zero in on Florida in just a minute. Where is Florida nationally? The United States, top tier consuming country. Where's Florida? Florida is number 3. California is number 1. Texas is number 2. Florida ranks number 3 for reports to the Human Trafficking Hotline. 3rd in the nation. We'll talk about where Tampa sits, where you're at, where are we in this 3rd reporting state. Here's our backyard. Look at those red hot areas in Florida. Number 1 is going to be Miami-Dade. They reported the highest number. That's probably not a shock, right? Tampa reports at 3rd. We used to be 2nd, and this is not saying we're doing a great job here. We used to report at 2nd, but now Orlando reports 2nd, and Tampa reports 3rd. In my view, and this is just my view, just having worked this on a street level, in my view, Orlando and Tampa should be reporting as 1. Why? Because of the I-4 corridor. So the I-4 corridor is a red-hot transportation hub. I just mentioned to you about the girl here in our area that is found in Orlando. A lot of the girls that are missing Orlando are found here. They run that I-4 corridor. It's red-hot, and that entire corridor is red-hot for transportation. So you can see where we're at on the state of Florida, and in the fact here we are in the Tampa Bay area, and the Tampa Bay area red hot with human trafficking activity. And again, we are reporting 3rd in the state, and Florida ranks 3rd in the nation when it comes to reporting human trafficking activity. So I just want you to kind of get an idea of how hot this area is with human trafficking activity. Hey, brother, it's good to see you. It's good to see you. I want to just kind of dwell here for a minute. And again, I don't have much time, so let me just hit this and move on. If you remember anything out of today, I want you to remember the human trafficking triangle. Why? Because the human trafficking triangle is a visual of what human trafficking is. It kind of talks about what's necessary to make human trafficking happen. Remember the triangle. So look at the top part of the triangle. You have a victim, you have a trafficker, and on the bottom of it you have a buyer. The idea behind this, the theory behind the triangle is if you could collapse one side of the triangle, you would collapse human trafficking. So that's the theory behind the triangle. If I could somehow or another recover every victim in the United States today, at least for a moment, and it would only be for a moment, but for a moment we would collapse human trafficking. If we could put together a federal, state, local law enforcement operation and arrest every single trafficker in the United States today, we would, at least for a moment, collapse human trafficking. But my question is always this, and you're going to hear me get a little bit, probably too little political correctness getting ready to come up. Because the only way to really permanently collapse the triangle is to take the buyer out of the market. Because the buyer represents demand. If there was no one buying human beings, there would be no need for a trafficker to recruit them, or to lure them, or to snatch them, whatever tactic they're using. If we could get demand out of the market, we would have no need for the supply. The supply would collapse if we got rid of the demand. But why aren't we getting rid of demand? Well, there's a couple reasons. Number one, and I'm just going to go ahead and say it, pornography is one of the highest drivers of demand. And the United States is a huge consumer of pornography. And not just the centerfold of your grandfather's Playboy, but violent and very driven by violence type of pornography. So pornography is a driver. The other thing that drives this is, of course, greed, is the entitlement of a buyer who thinks that they just have a right to buy another human being. Catch this. Who in their right mind believes that they're entitled to buy a person for their own consumption? It just drives me. But I'll tell you the other reason why, and this is something that we're fighting in Tallahassee this year for the session that's coming up, is why in the world are we charging a person who buys another human being, why are we charging them with a misdemeanor? When the victim, the prostituted person, who oftentimes, in fact, statistically, over 90% of all those who are being prostituted are doing it against their will. They're being forced or coerced to do it. We charge the victim with a felony after their third arrest. So it's a progression. Their third arrest, and all of them, or most of them, have been arrested more than once. So now we're charging them with a felony, and the person who bought them gets a misdemeanor. I stood in front of our House of Representatives, and especially our Florida Senate, and testified in front of them. Why? In my view, so this is where I get a little bit controversial, and some of the senators hate to see me walk into Tallahassee, but in my view, the buyer should be held equally culpable for the trauma being inflicted on that victim as the trafficker is. And if we're charging the trafficker with a felony, the buyer should be getting a felony. So our legislation this year says that first offense, not second, third, first offense, a buyer of another human being gets a third-degree felony. I don't know that it's going to pass. It didn't pass last year. It passed the House, didn't pass the Senate. Why? I don't know. I can't tell you why. Except for maybe, just maybe, as I told the senator sitting up there, just maybe we're looking at some buyers in Tallahassee who doesn't want to be popped with a felony. Just maybe. I don't know. Maybe that's just me talking out, but just maybe. I better move on or I get sued all the time, so I'm going to get sued again. So here we go. Here are the 4 stages of human trafficking. I'm just going to mention them. If we had time, I would really kind of go into these because I think it's important to understand. But you have recruiting, grooming, trafficking, and immersion. Oftentimes when they get to the immersion stage, it becomes cyclical and they become the recruiter, they become the groomer, and oftentimes become what's known in the business as the bottom. So the bottom then becomes that individual in the stable. We won't have time to go through that. I wished I had time to go through this, but I'll just mention this. CSAM. CSAM is a term that most people don't recognize. If you're involved in education, if you're involved in, I would encourage you to learn that acronym, because what we used to refer to in my generation as child porn is now being referred to as CSAM. And so you're going to see that really federal level, state level, you're starting to see a lot of this. What that stands for is child sexual abuse material, so CSAM. And the idea behind that is a child who had been forced into child pornography, there's a real tag of shame to that. And so we're trying to remove that stigma away from the child who's a victim. And so CSAM becomes that term, child sexual abuse material. Don't have time to go through this, but I will tell you this. When you look at these numbers for 1 year, that was gathered by NCMEC, which is the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. That's the John Walsh organization. So they get a federal money to run the cyber tip line. So NCMEC runs the cyber tip line. And look at 2020. 2021 just came out, but 2020, there were 21.7 million reports of CSAM that was driven to the cyber tip line. Now, catch that. That is kids in pornographic images and videos being reported to the cyber tip line, and in 1 year, 21.7 million reports, and each report contained multiple images. That's our kids being exploited on the internet. In 1 year, almost 22 million reports. And look at who's reporting. Facebook, 20 million. Now, I don't have Facebook. I don't like Facebook. I'm very open about that. But at least they're reporting. Because of the 21 million, they reported 20. Look at some of the others. Snapchat, are you kidding me? Snapchat, which is the preferred communication for CSAM among kids, and they reported 144,000? Are you kidding me? And Twitter, 65,000. When what most people don't realize, you can get to an entire pornographic side of Twitter with a hashtag. And I'll show it to you in just a moment, just quickly. In fact, Twitter's being sued right now by a really good friend of mine. Her name is Lisa Haba out of Haba Law in Orlando, and in COSI, which is the National Center for Sexual Exploitation. And her name is Danny Pinner, sits on a couple of boards of mine. They're suing Twitter right now because they exploited two 14-year-old boys. And I'll show you the case in just a moment. Two 14-year-old boys that were exploited on Snapchat, and then that images were shared on Twitter. And when Twitter was informed that they were 14 years of age, Twitter said, oh, we're just going to let it stay up there while we investigate. They investigated for 9 days. And in 9 days, those two boys were exploited. Two 14-year-old boys exploited 167,000 views while they investigated for 9 days. They're getting sued. And I am very proud to say that I am a consultant on that lawsuit. And you know what they claimed? We're immune. 230, we're immune, right? CDA 230. You know what the federal judge said this time? Not now. Because you let it stay up there and you monetized 167,000 views, in my view, you're the trafficker. Twitter was called a trafficker in federal court. I think that's a breakthrough. And I'm thankful. Now, people ask me all the time, what about has happened since Elon Musk has taken over? There's been some big changes. But of course, this was prior to that buyout. I won't have time to get through this. This is where I want to get to, and I'm going to stop here. 3 digital gateways. You have to know this. If you're a grandparent, parent, aunt, uncle, teacher, you have to know this. And so I'm going to go through this, and again, it's going to be kind of quickly, but catch this. There are 3 digital gateways. Why am I spending a little bit of time here? Because statistically, 60% of the 3 stages of human trafficking, the first 3 stages, 60% is now happening online. That number, because when you gather stats, that number is immediately 3 years old. Because you have to gather it, compile it. It's already outdated by the time you put that published. I personally think the number is probably getting closer to 80%. are being trafficked online, but the stat is 60%. And it's happening through these 3 gateways. Social media. Let me give you just, and this is going to get a little technical here, but just to kind of understand how social media is broken out. Social media is broken out in 3 categories. All social media falls into one of these 3 categories: synchronous, asynchronous, or no synchronous. So I know that's technical, but just what does that mean? Synchronous simply means that the 2 users have to be in sync in order to share information. So they call that synchronous, in sync. That means I send you a friend request, you accept my friend request, now we share information back and forth. We are in sync. LinkedIn is a big one. That's the only social media that I'm active on, is LinkedIn, and I put a human trafficking message every couple of weeks or so out on it. But LinkedIn and then Facebook is going to be the big boy, the big player in the synchronous space. Asynchronous you don't have to be in agreement. You choose to follow somebody, and now you can see their content. It's known as a follower type platform. And so your 2 big players there are going to be Twitter and Instagram, and there's some others that are really making some headway in that space as well. But that, to this day, is 2 of the big ones. That's asynchronous. The next one is no synchronous. This is the most dangerous. All of them are dangerous if they're not properly monitored, but this is your most dangerous, is your no synchronous. Because no synchronous, there's not any kind of tie to each other. These are known as wall platforms. You create a wall, and then somebody can anonymously post to your wall. Cyberbullying is huge in this space, especially for girls. Girls are hugely cyberbullied by having these platforms, wall platforms where somebody can post to their wall and remain anonymous. The 2 big players are probably going to be some that you probably have never heard of, Ask.fm, and the big player right now is Yik Yak. And I'll show you Yik Yak in just a moment. Yik Yak is, now catch this, because I think this is important. The downloads with middle schoolers of Yik Yak is going through the roof. Middle school, downloading Yik Yak. And most parents and grandparents have no idea, have never even heard of it. And yet middle school is just absolutely slammed with the downloads. So I'll show you that in just a moment. I'll show you what Yik Yak looks like. Here are your apps. Apps is the second gateway. I put together these 21. I would encourage you to learn these 21, but it's also important to understand this. Please hear me. These 21, so back in probably, 2015, 2016, I had worked with our SROs here in Pasco and had worked with our ICAC detectives, and we put together 21 apps that parents should know, and that was way back in 2000, probably 15 or 16. We posted it on our website, and I think, or at least the last time I checked, on the Pasco Sheriff's website, they still have some of that on there. I think it's been revised, but we had put those 21 up there. Last year, they reached out to me and said, man, some of these are kind of got old, which they do. They get old within probably 30 days. But they've got old, can we revise that? So in 2021, I revised the 21 apps. But please understand 2 things about this. Number 1, this is not exhaustive. There's a whole lot more apps than this, and a whole lot more that kids are on. I'm just trying to give you a representation of what these apps look like and kind of what they do. So here are 21 representative apps, not exhaustive apps. So as long as we understand that, I want to point out a couple of those. Number 1, I don't know if anybody's ever heard of Kik Messenger. So Kik was kind of the grandfather of encrypted messaging systems. So you would send a message, somebody was encrypted from end to end. They were not quite as sophisticated as they are today, wasn't quite military grade as it is today, but that was kind of the grandfather. That kind of went away, still out there, but kind of went away, and WhatsApp took its place. And you see WhatsApp, and most of us have heard about WhatsApp, right? And WhatsApp has a legitimate function. You can talk to people around the world on WhatsApp. It's got an incredible function. The problem is you got a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old who is messaging on an encrypted messaging system. And my point has always been, what 12-year-old needs to send messages encrypted, where I can't get to it if they end up missing? I say I like I'm still a cop. My people. If they're doing an investigation, what's the first thing that we need to do in law enforcement if a child, we need in their social media, because that's where they live. They reside there. That's where they're sharing information. If it's encrypted, I can't get to it. It's 256-bit encryption. It's military grade. It would take weeks with the best software to break through to get to that. It's incredible to me that they're sending messages there. Whatever happened to just sending it through the message on the phone? Because that's not cool. So WhatsApp, parents know about it. Kids are like, it's not cool anymore. Let me give you the two big ones right now. So the two big ones are Signal, and you see Signal, what it looks like over on your far left, about halfway down. That's Signal. The other big one right now that's being really downloaded is Telegram. So Telegram is a big one right now. So Telegram is massive. It's not on here yet. If I were revising this today, I would take out WhatsApp and put Telegram. So Telegram is big. The other one that I'll just kind of mention to you and move on because I want to get to the last one and then I'm done. See the calculator, the third one down from the left? The calculator app looks just like your iPhone calculator. It adds, subtracts, divides, multiplies, finds the square root. It's a calculator. Looks just like the icon for your calculator on your iPhone or your Android device. But when you put a certain number sequence in it, it rolls over and it's a vault. And in that vault will be contacts, videos, pornographic pictures, pornographic movies that they don't want anybody to know about, and they store it inside the vault. When mom and dad come into the room, they swipe up on the phone, it rolls over and becomes a calculator again. Mom and dad have no clue what lies behind that calculator. Is a vault. Most people look at me kind of like you are right now and say, "That Alan, these folks would not do that to us. That can't be true." And so my response to that is, don't take my word for it. Go to your app store in the search bar and just type the word vault. You tell me how many vault apps are available. Vault app. I did this probably 2 weeks ago at a presentation. A person inside the room went ahead and done it while I was talking, which I don't appreciate, but they did. I'm just kidding. They did, and they raised their hand and said, "Alan, I quit counting at 60. Not only are there calculators, but there's photo albums where you can store family vacations and pictures of your family, but when you swipe across with a certain pattern, it rolls over and it's a vault. Underneath that is stuff that they don't want anybody to know. It's overwhelming for parents and grandparents when they're trying to figure out, how do I protect my kids from predators? When you have these types of things that stand as barriers. So I would encourage you to learn more about the Vault app. And that's what that represents there. The last one I'm going to, and you see Yik Yak is all the way down at the bottom. It's the bull with the horns on it. That's the icon. Gaming, this one's kind of personal to me. My 14-year-old son, well, he was 14 at the time, little boy that I adopted from Guatemala. He is the most incredible kid you've ever met. He was adopted at birth. He was 7 months old when he landed in Atlanta. So the first time he ever set foot in the United States, he was 7 months old from Guatemala. He's now 21, but he was 14 at the time. And I always say that he's a little Mayan Indian. He's got coal black hair, coal black eyes, a little round face, dark complected. He looks just like his dad. He was about 12 years old. He was still about that tall. 14, he was about that tall. He's just a little guy. He's got Asperger's, so he has a little bit of trouble on the autism scale, but he's a tremendous blessing from God. But I'll never forget when he came into me at 14 and said, "Dad, you need to come see on my gaming system." He's playing a racing game with friends from school, but somebody from the school had invited somebody they didn't know into their game, into the chat. He said, "You need to look at this." And when I went and looked at it on an Xbox One in the home of a cop who does this for a living, he was being recruited, trying to get a meeting at a park down the street with my 14-year-old son. And when you look behind the mask, it was actually a 41-year-old male out of Wisconsin who's in the gaming system trying to recruit my son, who is, of course, struggling with autism. So gaming system is big, and I won't go through that because again, here's the case of Twitter, just so you see the case and you see some of the things there. This is a Twitter page where you can get to it with a hashtag. I won't have time to get there. I'm not going to stay on this because it's dirty language. I just want you to know there's a language that traffickers use in that trafficking world. They have their own language. You'll never understand what they're saying if you're listening to them sitting right beside you at the coffee shop. They can be talking, you won't have a clue what they're talking about because they have their own language. And I just kind of give you an example of that. This is the actual web page of a trafficker. Look at that wolf on the front. Now I put language of traffickers, but look at the top. When you spot a with low self-esteem, I'm just going to start licking my lips. Actual page of a trafficker. A couple things I'll mention to you. See how he capitalizes every P? He's letting you know straight up, I'm a pimp. He's not hiding from it. I'm a pimp. Look at the numbers he's using. 16 plus 304. Why those two numbers? P is the 16th letter of the alphabet. It means I'm being pimped. 304 is upside down for hoe. Those are the two numbers associated with trafficking. If you see those numbers in a tattoo, which we call branding, if you see those two numbers, they're being trafficked. It's not a question. They are being trafficked if you see those two numbers inside of a brand. This is the new communication, is emojis. This is what they're using now to communicate. Again, this is a representation. They'll put an emoji in a line, and that will have an entire meaning that you don't have a clue what it means. And I put some of those up there just so you know. If they're advertising a kid on Plenty of Fish, a dating website, which they do all the time, so Plenty of Fish is probably one of the worst for advertising kids for quote-unquote dates, they'll add an emoji inside the ad. And a buyer knows immediately they're buying a kid. They're not buying an adult. It's not a 19-year-old that likes long walks on the beach. It's a kid that's being sold. So they'll use these emojis inside the ad. Here's a type of branding. I'll close with this because this here is where it's going. If you're working with kids, you need to understand that they may not brand them with a tattoo because that's obviously, maybe an adult might have a tattoo. They're using bracelets and necklaces to brand the kids. If they come in with a bracelet and it has a charm on it, if they have an unusual attachment to it, they won't take it off for any reason. Or a necklace that they won't take off at night. They take showers with it. You may not because there's a lot of factors involved in there, but it could be a sign that they're being soft branded. And so that's what we refer to as soft branded. And then I'll just leave it on this screen here. I don't have time to go through anything else, so I'm going to stop right there. Let me put it back to here because I know some of you want to take a picture of that if you want to come up. Or if you want me to move back to the 21 apps, I'll be glad to do that. Questions? And then I probably only have time for one question, or maybe two. Any questions for me? No questions? Yes, ma'am.
When they're recruiting the kids, like, what if you saw messages? What is the type of language that they use to try to?
Yeah. So the question is about recruiting. What kind of language would they use in kind of the recruiting? Understand they're trying to exploit vulnerabilities. So they'll be asking questions like, hey, and it won't be in these terms, but what's your relationship like with your parents? How's your home life? Do you have enough money to buy the gifts you want? Is there anything you really want to have? They may say, well, I've always wanted that purse. Well, that's going to be an exploitation because now I'll buy you that purse, but now you owe me something. So now I'm creating a debt bondage in the mind of that kid. So it's going to be probing questions that really have to do with, many times, relationships. And that brings me to a really good question, a point, because most of the time we as parents and grandparents, myself included, we're scared to death that my child's going to end up missing, right? That they go to the mall or they go to a store and boom, they're gone, they're snatched. Truthfully, the snatch is about 3%. So the snatch is really low. Now we need to guard against it, right? So we guard and we talk about, back in the day we had stranger danger and all those kind of things that we did trying to counter that. But understand that it's only about 3% of kids who are snatched into the life. Most are lured in. They're created a relationship with a boyfriend. Becomes their boyfriend, and then the boyfriend says, hey babe, you know what? You said you love me. Now to a 14-year-old, you said you love me, right? Man, I really need some help. And so how about sleeping with my friend and he'll give us $100? They built that. I don't really want to, but man, I love my boyfriend, so I'm going to do it for love. I'm going to do it for the sake of a relationship. So a lot of the questions when it comes to that recruiting side is going to be probing those weaknesses so that I can become that to that person and fill in that gap. Great question. Yes?
Which age group seems to be the most vulnerable?
Well, statistically, what we're seeing right now is the average age that's coming into the life when it comes to kids is 12 to 15. The average age is 12 to 15. So obviously, now that's average. I mentioned the little girl that was 8. Right now I can tell you about a child that was 2 that was being trafficked down in Tampa. So when we're talking about this particular, it spans the ages, but just so you know, kind of the data shows us that 12 to 15 is kind of that, and I hate to use the word sweet, but it's kind of that age for kids. And I will tell one point just to cover that. Most adults that I've ever recovered will tell you horror stories of how they begin their life as a kid. So it's almost always beginning as a kid. Rarely does it start when they suddenly become 30 and say, I'm gonna go out and be sex trafficked. It usually starts very, very young with ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, on and on, all that kind of stuff. I want to thank you so much for having me. I think I went over my time. I apologize in advance. I get going and forget what the time is. Thank you for sitting here and listening. I'll leave this up here. I'll take it back if you want, just to have it up there for the 21 apps, because I know some people are trying to take pictures of that. And at least it'll give you an idea of a representation. Thank you so much.
We certainly appreciate you, Mr. Wilcott, and that presentation. It's very, very dark, but something we should definitely need to talk about and be aware
Absolutely.
of. So I'm going to, oh, you can't hear me? Oh, can you hear me now? Okay. Okay, so we're going to do the raffle. Miss Windland, if you'd like to come down and pull tickets. Anyone that did not get a raffle ticket?